And apparently we're live, but I'm sure it takes a little moment for it to get over there to LinkedIn.
LinkedIn blip.
Boom. LinkedIn, bing, bing. Waste a moment. Might be there now.
I reckon it's there now.
Okay.
Cool. Well, I'll start with the intro, which I think I've improved on from last week. So welcome everybody to Hear the People, our platform for leaders, business owners, founders, co-founders, anybody that works in the people space to share their experiences, wins, successes, challenges around this space we call our industry. How's that?
Glenn Martin.
Boom.
Yeah.
I've been practicing.
That's slick.
Yeah. If I can repeat it, that'll be even better.
Yeah, but you'll have to listen back to this bit of the show for next week, won't you?
100%. Do you want to introduce this week's guest, Katrina?
Oh, so obviously I'm Katrina Collier. I am super excited to introduce the one, the only, the amazing Jess Larsen, who you may not have heard of, but you will by the end of the show know so much more about her. Jess, welcome.
Thank
Jess.
you. Yeah, thanks, Glenn. What a lovely intro.
I'm looking forward to this one.
Give people a little snapshot, because we don't want to send them to sleep. So can you summarize your career in a few minutes of what you've done and what you're doing now? Yeah, give us 30 seconds. Who is Jess Larsen?
Yeah. Well, probably most importantly is fundamentally that I'm a co-Antipodean. That's probably the most important shout out with Katrina on the call. So I'm originally from New Zealand, but my career is pretty much in the UK and then supporting other geographies from there.
But that's why she says fashion chaps, not fish and chips. Okay, so
exactly.
Anyone who's confused and thinks she sounds Australian.
Yeah. Not Australian. Yeah.
No.
So, but I started, so career-wise, started in London in a high-growth hedge fund. Actually, spent a good 6 or so years, and we did lots of scaling. Then went from kind of 40 to 450 people, and international, and lots of money in the room, and doing things faster and faster, and seeing how the business kind of shifted year to year to totally radically different culture. And then kept going in finance, went into private equity, and then went into a radically different industry, went out to manufacturing, engineering, in a much larger corporate business, because frankly I'd had enough of finance and I wanted to see what life was like away from the money. And I almost went the other end of the scale, where like the people, processes, intelligence, what HR is in the room in that environment is completely different. It's basically bums on seats, lots of manual employees, and then obviously the engineering focus and totally different technologies. Lots of kind of big scale corporate work there, change management programs and things like that. And then went back somewhere in the middle into professional services, where I worked with a business who worked in the world of talent mobility, which is like moving employees around the world with large corporates. Did some work for them, also led their compensation. So I have a high compensation and reward background. And then went across to their consulting side. So actually left HR and went out as a consultant supporting these really big employers with how they're moving their people around the world. So almost like the biggest scale kind of work you can do in HR. And had that happening while the pandemic's going on. So the nature of the work kind of shifted radically, like everyone through the pandemic. And partway through that journey, felt like I was getting increasingly distanced and further away from the opportunity to make the difference on the ground. Looked at like what else is possible. Did some work in entrepreneurship, did an amazing boot camp with MIT beginning of last year, which I loved. Really looked at the whole theory of building a startup and what the validation life cycle and best practices there. And then I've made a jump this year into a role with Beam, who are based in Berlin. So I'm based in the UK. I'm kind of back and forth to Berlin. And
because she loves the non-EU queue.
Yeah. Compare notes on that.
And I love that every time I get to go to Berlin.
They just say, oh, Brexit. And what we do at Beam is company builder. So I think you've mentioned Glenn, incubator. So it's like a business that builds startups. So I run support and entrepreneurship program there. So basically constantly looking for active, experienced entrepreneurs in the market. They come into us, they figure out, working with us, we do deep research on problems that in specific to the logistics industry. So we're industry specific. And they come in the room with us, take that research further, go deeper on it, see if there's viability there to build a solution to market, normally tech solution. And then we support them building out a startup. And if they're successful, getting investment with our parent company or out to the wider fundraising market. And then also supporting them post funding on their launch strategy and how they grow over time. So 2 parts of that work. Yeah, super interesting work.
Which leads neatly into the title of today's show, which is People Pressure in Lean Startups, right? Because I mean, you kind of didn't mention any names there, but you've gone from the big corporate world, like Morgan Stanley, Accenture, EY, right? So the big players, right through to this startup incubator now. So you've got that full spectrum of kind of business experience, which I think can only benefit, obviously, the businesses that you're working with within the incubator now, right? Surely. And it was nice to notice that actually from a percentage ownership perspective, you're very generous towards the kind of founders, co-founders of the startup, more so than I've seen on perhaps other incubators, which is always nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, the deal always depends on, the value proposition and the equation and the funding and the capital, et cetera. So there are some indicative terms on the website, which are true, they're real. This is what's on offer, but the scale and shape of that is unique per startup based on their value prop coming in.
I think the transparency was the key for me. Sorry, Katrina. I was just like,
I just wanted to interject I can see, hence I look like I'm not paying attention because I'm just trying to keep an eye on the content, the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook. We can see that you're there. I will be slower to get to the LinkedIn and Facebook comments because we are sitting on Crowdcast. So if anyone really wants to get involved, come over to Crowdcast. There is a link anywhere you've seen it. Come over here.
Crowdcast,
because we can see your comments. I can see like Stephen and Debbie and Elaine and Tony and B are all here. So it's like, whereas over there, it's like I have to keep thinking to refresh the screen and it distracts me from the fun. Come to Crowdcast.
Come to Crowdcast.
Come to the cool kids in the room.
Cool kids are over at Crowdcast.
So I guess to kind of kick us off, I mean, we're talking people pressure and lean startups, right? So what are the typical challenges that any founder, co-founding team have when they start to think about that first stage of growth? So who do they hire first, and why, and what do they invest in that? I mean, are there? Because I'm assuming now, and based on my experience, there are some consistent themes in terms of some of the questions they have to answer, the challenges they have around kind of hiring. If there isn't, then completely pointless question.
Glenn asked really long questions, by the way.
Yeah, really long question. Just pick the part you want to answer.
You're thinking, gosh, by the end, am I going to?
Just pick the part you want to answer.
Let me dive in on it.
And I totally didn't warn Jess. I'm giving her thinking time, by the way. This is
Cool. So let me give that a go, Glenn. So some of it depends. So to caveat, what Beam do, as I said, specific to logistics and kind of that manufacturing landscape, essentially investments that make sense from our parent company. So we're a company builder attached to this investor parent, and they're really looking to leverage, the evolution of their business with further opportunity in this way of utilizing the startups, right? So they're independent in nature, but there's some correlation in how they can add value to their scaling through using the knowledge and expertise in Boima Group, who's the parent, right?
Gotcha.
So with that, we look specific to the logistics industry. So that means then we also look at a profile for businesses to fund that are tech-centric in terms of scale opportunity. So we're in this era of digitization. We're in the fastest era of change in business that has ever been seen before. And that's where you see, startup practices are just taking off, as taking advantage of that. And I feel like that's not going to be an everlasting. That's a specific point in time, and it'll reach a natural end or slow down. But right now, there's still plenty of opportunity, and logistics as an industry is riper for opportunity because it tends to be a bit behind the curve on digitization opportunity. Most of ours tend to be more B2B. So we're looking at people who, in terms of entrepreneurs coming through, it's skill sets that could be viable to make use of that opportunity space. So what they look for in early talent depends on the profile of founders coming in the room as a starting point. What do they know? Because at the end of the day, anything the founders can do themselves, they will do themselves, obviously. So it's where are the gaps in knowledge, and we always look at a co-founding team, so there's always at least 2 there. So you might have somebody with a high tech profile where they've got strong engineering capability. They might be building, the product with potentially some outsourced pieces to start. They may not necessarily hire permanent engineering or tech support from day one. You might have someone who's strong on the marketing or sales side, and they might take that lead. Or if they don't have that between them, that might be identified as a specific need. The other pieces is looking at what the shape of the business model is. What is it they're needing to create? How do they need to, what's the speed they need to get to market? Where are the priorities? So if it's something where they have to capitalize on early access to market, they might be looking at building that sales capability really early on. So those are it's more a matter of asking questions and figuring out what are those early hires. And then it's what makes sense. Do they need to invest in their own talent in the room, or do they make use of more flexible operations? And do they outsource pieces of work? Do they work with consulting support? Do they, can they hire less talented people in more of a tactical level, not have to invest, in senior talent from day one? So those are the types of questions, that we would see, or we would be asking, what does that talent map look like? What do you think you need?
All right. I have a really succinct question now.
Yeah.
On the incubator, how long does it kind of take to figure out that part? I mean, that particular process, is there a particular timeline where you're like, okay, cool. From the point of identifying the 2 co-founders to kind of understanding what they'll need to kind of start putting that business model
starting
together.
To hire. So I could talk from my experience of being. So I've been in the room from January this year and largely focused on the entrepreneur side of the house, making sure that pipeline's working really nicely. And so I've only seen late stages so far of one startup that we've launched. And then, of course, the startups we've already launched, supporting them who are more mature in their cycle. So what I'd say, when does that work start? So it depends. It'll be part of the thinking as they're thinking and building their business model and concept through the later stages of what we would consider validation, which is pre-pitching. So they're having to build out here's what the investment opportunity looks like, i.e. the business model, i.e. here's the early hire projection. So typically there would be some indication of early hire projections in the pitch deck, at a minimum to say, as co-founders, here's the talents that we have. Based on our background, you're buying essentially people who can do this stuff. We're expecting to hire 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 early people over the first 6, 12 months, whatever it is. So there's some kind of initial projections there. And then in the business plan, typically there's headcount projections that they'll have built out and guesstimated really. That's the bit where it starts to get, from what I've seen, a little bit more hazy, depending on their experience levels of. So some of the work, that I've kind of had the opportunity to get into is helping them understand what they might need to know about the market, or they've tried things that have failed and why have they failed and what might be there. The challenge, I guess, is there's an awful lot that goes on with people practices that I think as a function or as a capability is massively underestimated by people who don't do this work, because so much of it looks like it should be obvious. You do what you think makes sense.
It's just fluffy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that reaction of like, well, obviously you just do this. It's like, well, it's kind of not obvious, because actually there are quite a few things to think about here of like, well, why would you do that? And what are your options? And why don't, have you considered these alternatives? And so it's bringing that reflection to the table. So some of, I guess, that I try to bring, and I still feel relatively early stages in bringing this value. Like, even though I've been in the room for, 8-9 months, I still feel like I'm just getting my teeth into really supporting the founders on this type of conversation. Some of it's about getting a close relationship with them of what do they know and what might they think they know that maybe their experience, the pieces we can add to to strengthen pieces. So some of it's bringing information to the table of, better practice examples of what might happen, or in some cases, risk examples of how things could go wrong, and why you might not want to do it that way. And some of it's kind of education. And then some of it's also slowing down to get the chance to kind of look at that business strategy in a bit more detail, and to ask those questions, that I was saying of what does your business model need to look like in, the 6, 12, 18 month timeline? How do you see that being built out? What are the assumptions you're making, and helping strengthen the quality of those assumptions?
Yeah, definitely.
Experience. Yeah.
100%. And that's an interesting point you make, because sometimes I find kind of founders or co-founders think about forecasting in the context of what they need in their kind of growth plan.
Yeah.
And then you start to go, okay, cool. So maybe you need a software developer in 3 months' time. What makes you think you can hire a software developer in 3 months' time?
Yeah.
and then suddenly they're like, well, that's what we need, and we'll go to market. And you're like, okay, what market information is validating that assumption at this stage? And then you tend to find out that, perhaps there may be further kind of research required, or, their source of information are perhaps other founders who co-founders who have other co-founders and founders as a source of information. You're like, okay, cool. Where's the root of this? Who actually know? Who's feeding this information to these people that they can assume they can hire a software engineer in like three months' time? And I think that's always the interesting part. And how do you approach that, to your point, in a education context? If they have really strong feelings around, we'll hire that person in 3 months' time, how would you advocate approaching that kind of conversation?
Yeah, I think, you can look at like external data of like, hey, these are standard statistics or whatever. You can talk from your own experience of like, here's what I've seen doing this. But often what makes is most credible is examples of other founders going through exactly the same journey. Like, I find founders listen to founders more than anyone else, which can be good, can be bad, but
yeah,
it
could be quite disastrous.
Yeah, but can be really good to help say, look, here's some people, and in our community, the value is having, a couple people further down the road, gathering in my journey, it's kind of gathering some of those examples. Like, I've managed to pick up a number of really interesting quotes about, a couple of founders have said to me things like, my God, of all the areas of my business I need to manage, the people aspect is so much harder than I thought it was going to be. This is the one area, like all the other areas I can figure out. But and it's really that we underestimate how complex people are. And I had this funny conversation the other week about basically what you're doing is you're taking the most complicated computer on the planet, which is the human brain, and you're putting it in your environment. And then you're multiplying it. And so you then have these incredibly complicated machines in the room that all behave slightly differently, that all have different coding and programming. And then you expect them all to do what you want them to do and behave the way that you think they should behave, because that's the way that you've been programmed and coded.
Yeah.
And so for someone in a kind of software background, like that can have a bit of resonance of like, oh yeah, shit, we're all actually running totally different programs.
Yeah.
And also that's a good thing. Like we want that diversity. Like so it's finding that sweet spot of reality check of like, people are complex, and some of why there is a function here that has a specialism and trying to support you and learning how to do that. And I think where HR or people practices can be underestimated is also, I know from my own career, I felt like this is a function which has evolved dramatically in the time that I've worked in the HR function or the people function, that what we're doing in business now is radically different to what we were doing 15 years ago, and what's expected and the value we can bring. But part of that is just around evolution and psychology and org psychology and understanding like how people work together and the speed of work, and all radically trying to shift into this digital environment and all those things, but with that comes layers and layers of data and learning along the way. And so I actually think the potential for a strong people function to make a difference is stronger now than it's ever been. But it also means there's this real variance of quality of like what HR does and who's in the room and capability. And that's tough. It's like what the people functions in one business could be a totally different thing and have a different value in a different business.
So so this also almost sounds like why I started my LinkedIn newsletter, which was all about talent acquisition has a reputation problem kind of thing, doesn't it? Fundamentally, like there's such a broad range of like from just really our administrators to extraordinarily developed talent intelligence, talent attraction, you name it. So what's your advice to those who perhaps are that people person in a startup to make sure that they are seen as a valuable partner? Because you know what happens? They ramp up really, really fast, and then they want to sell, and they just let go of all the fluffy departments.
Yeah.
And it's crazy, which is crazy, when they want to sell. So it's what's your advice to that person? So
yeah, I think it's a game of you have to be constantly listening and looking outwardly. I think is super, super important. So not and it's hard because a lot of people, particularly in early stage or smaller businesses, you're transactionally running really fast. You're basically trying to do these things, and so yes, you're trying to automate stuff and make it more efficient or whatever, but often it's a challenge to get through that day-to-day work. But I think finding, like, you have to build space, and you have to talk with your leadership about, if you can't get it, you need to create the space, get the help to create the space to look outwardly, because the landscape is evolving so rapidly. And you guys know, working in talent acquisition, like how much talent acquisition is evolving in the sense of candidate behavior, even just through the pandemic. It's like candidate behavior is completely different from what it was 3 years ago. And if you're not listening to that and paying attention to it, and you have a drop in recruitment, and then 6 months later you go back to the market, you might find that what you were doing last year doesn't work next year. And you have to educate yourself and be listening to that and paying attention to it and learning from others. So I think networking is super, super important, like finding a posse of people that you respect, that you value, reaching out and connecting to, whether it's on social media or ideally face to face if you can, wherever you are. But I find you can use the social networks that are out there. I'm a huge advocate of, yes, connecting with people, but then actually get in touch, like actually have a conversation with them. Hey, I'm super curious about this thing. I'd love to have a virtual coffee when you've got 15 minutes. And you can find that then they can connect you with other people, and then you've got a real relationship, and there's some real learning happening. There's a number of people that I've had mentoring from, or I've mentored other people through my career, totally reach out. I think the people function can be very isolating, because you often particularly if you're a sole person, that you're on your own and you're listening to all this stuff and you're trying to figure out, what the hell should I be doing, and how should I be learning and growing? How do I push back on this leadership? Because a lot of what you're doing is trying to bring better practice, and in many cases you have to push back on your leadership. We have to say, hey, look, I think there's a better way if we do it this way, or hey, if we do it this way, we might be creating risk or losing opportunity. So those would be the big factor pieces. And then there's some fundamentals, and like understanding the breadth of what good HR or people practices entails nowadays. Like definitely like the data linkage, like how well are you looking and using at data in your practices, because that field, there are some really nice tools that are coming into play, and that I think is only going to expand. And because that represents efficiencies in your processes, it should also represent intelligence coming back, and then improving quality of decision making. And then you can use that data in your arguments when you go back with your leaders and so on. So those would be the big ticket. And then, it's like listening to the conversation is the biggest thing, and finding people that, excite you, inspire you, follow them, listen more, learn more, reach out, get more experience.
That's really cool advice. I'd love to know. I think Sophie's here somewhere. I'd love to hear in the comments if that resonates with her. Sophie Power's here somewhere. I've seen, bless her, sharing it on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Awesome. So there's a couple of pieces from that you kind of, I just want to touch on, Jess, which is one with your compensation and benefits hat on. When do you start advising kind of startups to think about that? Because obviously pay scales, benefits, that sort of thing. Sometimes I find, you can enter a 30, 40 person company, pay scales are all over the place. Some people have got equity, some people haven't. Some people have, kind of certain benefits, some people don't. And it's kind of, is that something you consciously sort of start to try and bake into the conversations you're having with startups now? Because I find it can be, it's so tricky to retrospectively try and, kind of level that when you're 60 or 70,
So it has come up in a couple to date, and I haven't gone through, done an audit across some we have. So that's on the radar. Look out, this will come next year. And we've looked at tools and so on. And I'd say there's some fundamental principles that are super, super important with compensation that, like, if you step back and you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty important. Things like, you know, reflecting on what your base and variable is, thinking, what can you adjust? Like, the thing is once you bake something into fixed reward, you can't take that away again. Like in most countries, legally, you can't take it away again unless you do like terrible consultation. And obviously with the psychological contract with employees, you're just like destroying your trust. People, if you ever go and take away from salary, right? It's the last thing you want to do. So you've got these levers. It's like looking at it like levers to pull. And whatever you bake into the fixed side, you can add more on the variable side. And then it's thinking, what term are you talking to? What's the common access to that? What drivers are you actually driving? Are there things you want to drive? Are you looking at retention? Are you looking at, you know, motivation? Are you looking at sales, et cetera, et cetera? So thinking about how you structure reward is important, and having some knowledge of what options are available to you. You know, yes, there's equity. Yes, there's virtual equity. There's other alternative options related to equity. So you can have trackers, you know, that aren't necessarily giving up equity, but you're giving a linkage to that long-term performance where they still get reward out of it. Or you can build incentive plans that attract off pieces or off specific pieces of performance, you know, like sales plans, et cetera. And so that's all on the cash side. And then thinking, like, I think as you get more mature, when you get to bigger organizations and you talk about benefits, some of the key aspects are things like, where do we find things that are attractive to the people in the room, but also often like make use of tax efficiencies for the company or our collective purchasing power, or like, how can we just basically do good deals, you know, for our people, right? So that's where you get like more comprehensive benefit packages where you've got all kinds of funky stuff going on. Some of it's because it's like, hey, actually, it's really cheap for us as a company to do this, but you get this really nice reward out of it that's going to cost you a lot more out of your net package. So, and then you get into the world of like, what's the right types of benefits to offer? You know, what profile is your employee landscape? Who are you trying to attract? Why do you want to have it? Do they care? How much admin does it take to do stuff? And I would, so I'd say like a really small business, most of the time, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have tons of bells and whistles. Just frankly, from an admin perspective, it's like nobody really cares that much. So it's I would be thinking about what's happening with your talent attraction, who are you trying to attract and what do they care about? So the big ticket drivers is, you know, flexibility at the moment, like can you have full remote, hybrid, you know, those things are mattering more than any other traditional benefits at the moment. And then the really undiscovered one that I think, you know, most smaller businesses have huge opportunity to leverage is on your development side. So can you, and I've been talking with a couple of our startups, I'm like, what can they be doing? Because what startups can do that's completely different from what a larger company can do is that you can actually give a personalized development plan that is real, that is baked in, that says, look, you know, Magic Mike coming into us, you know, we think you're freaking amazing. We think you've got the potential to do this, this, this. We're going to have these opportunities opening up because we're scaling, because we're going to have more capacity. We're going to we're going to invest in you to go do this extra piece of learning. So then you get better, we get a better person. Normally you're paying them like slightly lower than market, but you're getting a really nice return. They're growing. So
and they're happy as well because they're learning.
Definitely.
I think it's important.
Because you can't get that journey elsewhere. Sorry.
So I just want to say, because I called them out in the written comments, so I just want to make sure. Because I said, Sophie, yes. So going back to the little bit earlier, yes, I've been solo people and talent team in startups for a long time. Finding support and mentorship often means going out to the community. It's huge benefits though. Learning from the world around you is hugely beneficial in a startup. And Debbie, hi Debbie as well. 100% with you. Learning from the other people who have been in similar shoes is just so valuable. I don't think we do enough of that.
I think just kind of listening back to, you know, what we've been talking about for like the last 25 minutes, it just goes to show and illustrate how big the people function, how much responsibility it has. So if you're a founder, co-founder sitting there thinking, oh, recruitment is kind of just this linear track of just hiring and bringing people into a business. People function is massive. There's so much you need to kind of consider, right?
Yeah, we did this. I did this workshop. Glenn, when I first came in like maybe month 2 or something, and been across the founders, and because I was saying, you know, what would be most helpful for you, and recruitment was the biggest noise. I said, okay, well, let's do a workshop. You know, I said, let's have so let's have a look at the journey. Let's, you know, just explore what's happening. And so I built out this kind of like workflow of like, here are the stages of recruitment, right from like pre-need, like before you even have a need. What does your brand look like? Like, what's your readiness? Are you thinking, you know, what are the things you need to do? Thinking about structure, thinking about role design, thinking about like, does this talent exist? You know, as you said, to your research, like what is possible in the market? Like really, like not going hugely detailed, but just going highlight, hey, these are things that would help you if you think through all these steps. And then of course, through the life cycle and through like, you know, all the things that people can miss around, yes, candidate-centric experience, but how you need to prepare your process well in advance so that when you basically hit the button and you get the candidates, you can handle them as fast as you can and make the offer as quickly as you can. And then, as you mentioned, Glenn, just as we came on the call, like make sure that person being onboarded is being taken care of. And they come totally ready.
Part of it. Yeah.
So
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know that we've ever really had such a market where people just can have an offer. As Glenn discovered the other day, I couldn't believe it was the first time Glenn had this happen, by the way, which is extraordinary in his 15 years of doing this. But someone signed a contract and didn't start, and he was shocked. And I wasn't, which is really quite worrying. Shows you how often I hear that happens. But people don't. It's a different world now. So you've got to do all that stuff. You've got to.
Yeah.
And if founders are just too busy,
and there's this
playing the busy card.
Yeah. And I think what I see with founders is there's a high risk that, you know, they can be some of the most motivated and driven people in their relationship to work. And so one of their adjustments has to be, you know, really relating to their employees, like they're unlikely to have the same level of motivation that you do, you know, and you've got to be honest about that and be like, look, you know, what are they really here for? What's the deal for them? Like, oh, but we're offering them all this stuff. I say, yeah, that's great. As is pretty much everyone else. Like, that's the problem is like you actually, how much effort you need to be putting in. And like, why would someone want to come work for you? You know, talking to them through the interview journey of like, you need to use those stages of connection to be showing these people why it's going to be totally worth their while to come to you, why they're going to have an amazing journey. You're going to be taking care of them. You're going to be adding value to their career. It's like, it's real. It's like, you got to put that sales hat
goes back to, and Debbie's just written again, like upskilling instead of, you know, so often they're like, they want somebody who's out of one of the fangs or mangas or whatever they're called these days. And it's like, it's not possible. You can't compete. And actually, I don't think you'll get the loyalty either, because somebody who is good enough for them isn't going to come to a startup anyway. So it's that. And I do think, no, they're not going to be, like you're saying, it's not their baby, right? You know, Glenn and I get that. We're both founders. Like, it's not, you know, we've got more passion for it than anyone possibly could. But they would, if they're being developed, actually be really loyal and really productive and really happy. So as well. Pam's written 100% agree. Founders need to understand that some people are not rock stars, and that is okay.
I actually love that comment, Pam. I think I've just been doing some work this week on that of like that you can try to hire everyone to be rock stars, but you need to be super aware of like what that's going to cost you, not just in compensation, but in effort and waiting. Sometimes waiting and recognizing, like when we talk about diversity, sometimes diversity also means not everyone is an A-star everywhere, like and hiring for where their strength is and recognizing with that high strength might come less capability or like maybe less socially interactive, maybe less collaborative, maybe some other things. And like if you're building that, going back to the point around humans being the most complicated machines on the planet, like as a founder, like this is your company, this is what you're baking in and thinking that through. And that's where your HR or people stakeholder should be the person who's bringing that lens of thinking about this. Well, how are we going to build an environment that's going to work for that diversity?
Can I just... Sorry, I just really want to take it back to this whole getting rejected. So Glenn in the chat over on Crowdcast, for anyone watching elsewhere, he was rejected by text. He wasn't ghosted, he was rejected by text. And he's really upset about that, which just shows he's a Gen X. And Sophie was at least rejected by email. But can I just say this is hilarious, because before we came on the line, Jess was going on and on about the fact that she actually rarely checks their emails. It's about once every 3 days. And I was quite horrified that somebody would only check their professional
I check
email.
the high urgency ones, but not.
How would you know what's high urgent if you don't open the mailbox?
I see them come, and it's like, okay, I read some of those, but I can't. Like,
she probably never opens her spam folder.
No, I think, yeah, I mean,
which is really bad, because so many emails end up in there that are important. It's just, anyway, sorry. I just thought that was quite ironic from our before chat.
Kind of, again, reliving the text message. Anyway, it was really chirpy, cheerful text message as well.
Didn't ghost you. Come on.
Just kind of, if you think of it in context, it was just like bizarre. Anyway, one thing, just in your experience, Jess, that there is always an interview question that founders and co-founders ask, and it's invariably sometimes going to be the one where they almost sway slightly on an individual they've interviewed, which is, why do you want to join our business? And oftentimes I find some of the references are, well, they didn't seem particularly passionate about joining the business, or they weren't excited about joining the business, or the answer was quite generic, etc., etc. And I wonder, do you think it's a fair interview question to ask? And is it, kind of, because we want to understand their motivations.
I told Jess that this was a lovely show to come on to.
Well,
here's another. Glenn always throws these questions in. He's awesome.
Look, in my experience, it will always get asked whether you recommend that it doesn't or not, right? I just wonder how much consideration we should give to that in the final decision making. To your point around, if we're talking about kind of capability, experience, have they delivered against an assessment? Have they answered the interview questions correctly, et cetera, et cetera? Could we live with perhaps somebody that doesn't seem at this stage as excited as me as a co-founder and founder, but that 95% of the interview has given me an indication that this person could be a good hire? And just curious to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure. So for me, it depends what stage the startup is at and what's the importance of this role. So if it's really early stage and every single role in the room is has high autonomy and needs to be driving things forward, then yes, that motivation and connection to the business purpose and I want to be here, I want to be in this business, I would say yes, that's probably much, much more important, because you need them then to have high ownership over where they take things, and to have some degree ideally of emotional buy-in to that, of I care about it, it is a motivator for me to make a difference there, blah blah blah. But as you get, I think, a bit larger and there's a bit more structure in the room, and you start to have layers and leadership and so on, it's probably not as massively important. Then for me, it's more about what value can this role potentially deliver that person in their career. I'd be more interested in that question, because the bigger things get, the further you get away from that core centric purpose and your ability to influence it. So when you get to the 70 to the 100 type level, hiring somebody who's less junior in the structure, who's a lot further away from the power seat, what they're doing, what's going to matter is the work they're doing, and less, yes, I care about this business, I'll cut me in half and I'm so and so. So yeah,
that's a great answer. Great answer.
Oh, good. Okay,
love that.
I'm glad.
Love that. Yeah, I love that. I completely agree. I think, those critical first hires, you just want them to be so bought in and passionate. But when you get to 60, 70, 100, 150, I mean, it's kind of come on. They're sitting in front of you and they want to interview for a role you're offering, and their passion for the business may grow once they join, and you show them what kind of career pathway they can have.
And I think that's one of the hardest things with this high growth trajectory, is that what you're doing and the nature of what you're trying to achieve is by nature of growth going to change every 6 months, 12 months. It's going to be different. It's going to be radically different. So the things that you hired for generically 6 months ago for every hire will not be the same and need to be reviewed. You need to be checking, hey, what now is new about this organization, and that we can sometimes afford to take off the list that actually that's not as important anymore. And now this is more important. It's more important that we get people who can follow processes maybe, or work in a bit more governance, because you're starting to get more structure. So it's that nature of change and keeping up with it. Yeah.
Awesome.
Soph's got a good comment here. The need for someone to come in and be a doer in early-ish startups is overlooked sometimes. The work is super important.
Yeah.
B has a really interesting question. Thanks, B. I totally agree that learning from other people, leaders working in startups and scale-ups is essential. Anyone got recommendations on alternatives to CIPD training for heads of people in our world, for someone who does want some formal training? See, I think of Kelly Springer when I think alternative, right? I think she's like completely going against the grain there. But is it formal training? I don't know.
So I would say the formal training I would look to for someone who is curious. And I think the CIPD does some stuff that they do really well. And then there's a lot of other stuff that there are better sources for. So one group I follow, AIHR, based in the Netherlands, they do really nice data work, and which is an underdeveloped skill, I'd say, in general in HR functions, and one we all need upskilling. So they do some very nice programs. The other one I love is Josh Burson, does amazing work out from his. So that's like big scale corporate kind of HR stuff, and I looked a lot at that in some of my prior roles. But he looks at aspects like, how does design thinking lay over the employee experience and stuff, where we should be going in that direction, and we're not going there fast enough. So he does a very
It's interesting you mentioned that, Jess. I know somebody that does design thinking workshops to help talent acquisition professionals.
I do. Well, no, and HR. Actually, the last one I did. The last one I did was. I know we don't know which side I'm sitting on, but I'm here. The last one I did was actually super cool. Like for particularly people in TA who face this, it was actually how can the TA and HR department work so closely together that they're focused on retention and recruitment at all times. So they're getting it. And it was so cool because they completely restructured the department after that and rolled it out just from a one-day workshop. Amazing. That's why design thinking is so powerful. Everybody gets a voice. It's not a loud person, and everyone gets to brainstorm the solutions and they want the change. I love it. I can't do enough of it. So thanks for that, Glenn, for the little plug. Everyone just doesn't realize that's what I actually do. They just think,
this is it.
No,
this is kind of letting folks know what you do, Katrina. That's the key thing. So,
and I need to. Can I just do one more plug on that, because I know Lee's asked that question, and actually I've just been doing some work with Lee, and she's been incredibly valuable, like looking at how we help evolve our founders in this people dimension. So I've got to plug B as well, where she may not be doing necessarily that specific training, but super, super valuable, like to just explore these conversations and figure out how the frig do I get the right perspective with these founders.
Did you meet at Disrupt then? Is that how you met B?
Do you know, Katrina? I don't even know. It's so long. Yeah, maybe it was Disrupt. Maybe it was. I think it might be before that actually. But
socializing around.
Good minds think alike. Clearly,
there is a question I want to ask, and Katrina was like, frame this the right way, because I don't want it to be controversial. But we know, like, UK,
don't
European,
drop her in it.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of investor kind of. I guess investors at the moment across UK and Europe are kind of dialing down a little. There's not as much kind of investment going into kind of startup scales, regardless of the industry sector. It seems to be kind of across the piece. And I'm working with, kind of startups and scale-ups that are, kind of looking at that and kind of planning for, a kind of recession, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess the conversation that I'm having is, do you continue to kind of feed the hiring process? Even if it's like 1 or 2 hires, you just keep that going for the next couple of quarters, just so that your employer brand is still kind of present, or do you just completely turn the tap off and just wait and think Q2, Q3 next year, that's when we'll start to recruit again? And I just wondered whether you had an opinion on which way you would advise companies to go, or you've observed, kind of companies within your network and what they're doing. Because I think for me, I would advise them to continue to feed that employer brand, because that's the piece that you can kind of control. That's the piece that, kind of everybody will recognize, if you will. I think the kind of talent brand piece is something we know is the piece that you can't control. That's a slightly more organic thing. But my advice is just continue to, promote your employer brand. Keep it present, because you don't know what next year's market is going to look like, and you may need to ramp up very quickly. And this whole talk around recession could just completely disappear, and then you're in a...
It'd just be the press scaremongering.
Exactly. So that's a really, really long question, because I'm trying to word it in a way that doesn't draw you out and make anything specific. But just
no. I am from New Zealand. I will be blunt and brutal as well. It's fine.
Cool.
Not
as blunt and brutal as my lot, but close enough.
Slightly more delicate than the others. So it's a great question. It's a really great question about, does it make sense to continue to keep the engine, the pipeline, the momentum in the market going? And the answer for me would depend on, like, back to what the business model is and where you're trying to go, and what impact that market dynamics having. Like, are you as business leadership, holding your cards close to your chest, or are you putting things on pause? Are you expecting to ramp back up? So it's aligning with wherever those objectives are, and hedging the bets a little bit of, where checking where the assumptions are being made. So being aware of the assumptions that you're making. So, like, I can't remember if we had the call live when we had this conversation, maybe it was before we opened it, but you're talking about, like, people underestimating the length of time to go to market. Let's get a sales director in 3 months, right? The reality being, hey, and you maybe have to, like, build that up before you actually land that person. They've got a notice period at the other end once you're off, blah, blah, blah. So underestimating the length of time this stuff happens, and that's super, super risky in the recruitment life cycle. That's probably the biggest thing with the workshop we did that came out of it. And I think it depends on your business model and your strategy. Also, potentially depends on the type of talent you need to attract and what their behavior is. So there's a lot to be said for keeping that cold to warm end of the pipeline, like, somewhere engaged, because if you turn everything off and you go dead, that's high risk. The other aspect is where you're letting go of people, probably checking in and measuring and having, some awareness of what are the noises going out to market off those people exiting. What's the experience? Like, how is that experience being managed? How well have we actually done it? How are they really feeling? Are we capturing all that next? And are we really taking care of them as best we can? And I do think there've been some horror stories on people being let go, and I've just been thinking, oh my God, their brand is being cauterized in the market. Who the frig is going to want to go and work for that business with that level of exposure?
That's the biggest change, and anyone who's heard me speak ever knows this, and I talk about it in my book. That's the biggest change. People are really bold now, and I think that people had to get technically savvy during the pandemic, so they're even more bold. I put new examples in addition to, which of course I would just have to show, just in case anyone hasn't seen the bright orange, beautiful color that it is. And but if people writing it right there on LinkedIn, LinkedIn where everyone gets hired, and they're writing their experience. They don't care. Yeah. We would have cared when we started out about the repercussions. Oh my God, we would not do that when I get another job. What about references? Right now it's like, who gives a shit? Jess fired me. I feel like this, they didn't even give me time. They didn't, I mean, look what's in the news right now, which we're not going to talk about because that would be quite disrespectful for our period of mourning. But what happened there, and they've still got it wrong. They've still let people go at the wrong time. They could have just waited a week. And it's the reputation is marred. Who'd want to go and work there in the future?
Yeah.
And then I also caveat a little bit when you talk on the employer brand side that, like, I do also think sometimes in people circles that we can listen to our own hype a little bit with the employer brand. Like, I think, I also think there's a lot of candidates who don't do their homework, who don't listen, who don't really check out what that brand is necessarily as well. So, and I do, and I think that particularly talking with founders is like, I can't really pummel them about, hey, this is the most important thing, because they know as well as I do that there's a lot of candidates don't give a toss about it, and also depends on what they're motivated on. So I exercise some caution with weighing two. It's like, hey, it's a risk. Sometimes it's about what's the kind of person you might want to attract? What are the types of roles? What types of skills? What might they care about? Might those people care about this stuff?
Yeah.
But if you're hiring very transactional roles and they're not there for the long term, they're probably not going to care. So then you probably unfortunately can afford to treat people pretty badly. Like, so some of it's a bit of realism in the equation as well, because I do think as a HR kind of people folk, sometimes we get overly attached to these like best practices, like, hey, you must do it. It's like, actually, no, lots of businesses don't have to do it. I mean, I wish they did.
I have to, obviously I'm always in the hard to hire area, not the it's transactional. I never work. I've never been in the other place, to be fair.
Do you think that and completely left field question, do you think founders and co-founders actually understand the difference between employer brand and talent brand? Do they make that distinction between employer brand
as in the bit brand?
Tell me what.
So the brand. If you define it,
the employer brand. Is it in my book?
It does hint to it in your book. So the employer brand is the bit that you promote in terms of your as a place to work, your company as a place to work. So that's a bit you can pay for. You can put on your careers website. You can push out. You have that kind of control over it. Whereas the talent brand is more the social and public version. Yeah, the bit that where people talk about how about how they feel to work in your company. Their experience of your company. The stuff that you actually like. The glass doors, et cetera, the bit that you can't control, you can only react to because people are freely sharing what they think and what they've experienced and what they feel. And there is a distinction between the two. The employer brand, you can control because that's you pushing, is marketing to the talent market. Whereas the talent brand is the bit you need to nurture and that you need to put time in to nurture. And I just wonder in your experience whether you found co-founders immediately make that kind of distinction. I tend to find they just wrap it all up in one. It's like, well, that's just our employer brand. And I think it's an important distinction to make. Yeah,
I would definitely think they're wrapping it up because they're not even thinking about this stuff in that much detail to start with.
Yeah.
So it's,
but there are actions. There are actions related to the two, aren't there? There are actions that distinctly you need to do, which is in the under the umbrella of kind of people and recruitment. And then it's kind of like, okay, the employer brand we can measure because we can measure interactions with our website, careers page, etc. The talent brand bit is slightly more difficult to measure its impact unless you're continually getting feedback, but yet it's still an essential part of what a recruiter does. You know what I mean? Building and ensuring that kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably add to the talent brand well beyond recruitment, though. I would add the entire employee life cycle. And so sure. I would add all of your internal survey data if you're doing any sentiment analysis, and then out the other end of exit interviews and so on. And I think that data sometimes can be really rich. And it depends what your culture is and listening to that and, how much time and effort you want to spend, how big you are, like how much do you need to actually measure it, and how much do you just walk around the room and talk to people and ask them sometimes, or have one-to-ones, or gather input from the management, etc., and how much people want to share with you or don't want to share with you, what they're thinking, feeling. And I think your culture,
which is the big one,
the culture of how you're going to work and how people feel they can be safe to say stuff, how psychologically safe is the environment, how transparent is the culture.
And even if it is, so often they won't, because there's that whole I don't want people to realize I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm not going to share. And things that people hide it if they're insecure, and again, so it's going back to your complex beings.
Love that analogy. Love that.
Right? I mean, it does. It just brings it back full circle. Yeah. But I also think, Glenn, with what you're asking is that they're busy founders. They're not going to split it out and think one matters over the other. I mean, they're just, I actually just think it's really quite simple. If you treat your people well, you will have a great talent brand and people brand or employer brand or whatever you want to just.
Yeah.
I think comes from just being a good leader, but they're learning because they're founders and they've never done it before. And
I think the key thing I find different supporting the founders is the speed at which they're needing to go, which, I think people working in other more complex structures probably feel they go fast as well. But it's not necessarily just the speed, but it's the range of different things they're trying to pay attention to all at the same time. And so, of course, they're trying to make decisions quickly, and they're trying to make high quality decisions, and you lose the quality by nature of moving so quickly, and so yes, needing to bring that attitude and that intentional design of let's try it, test it, measure it, fail it, move on. And getting, I think, comfortable with that. Of like, I think as a people practitioner working in that culture, the advantages hopefully are that you do get more rope to play with stuff and to try different things, and to just like, let's do a micro piece here, let's do it on this 5 employees and see what happens, without needing to, in a corporate landscape, you're building out a whole projects and like initiating and doing your corporate communications. You don't have to do all that work, so you can just get on and do it. But it also means you've got less data, to make decisions, feedback from, and to learn from. So that's where the looking outside is very, very, I think, really, really important. Of like, learning more about what's happening, because you're really in this microcosm, and that I think the culture, there's tremendous advantages to working in that smaller scale, because yes, you can look around the room and hopefully see people and have deep relationships and really great teamwork. But there's also great risk of that, as you lose potentially the diversity of thinking, and everybody gets very homogenized, and you get in that echo chamber and all that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, that. Very cool.
True,
well, there was a couple of bits that we'll probably have to say for another conversation, to be fair, Jess, because I was interested in your thoughts around kind of neurodiverse hiring within startups, but that's a big subject on its own.
Oh yeah.
Let's do that with 4 minutes left on the show.
It's just kind of like, hey, let me just throw that one in there, see if we can get a bite.
Oh my goodness,
interesting one.
I mean, like 2-minute thoughts is like, I mean, that's an area I'm super, super curious about. Like I've been engaging more and more with people in that field, had some fascinating conversations with people doing work in that field. And I think it's because as a field, it's evolving so rapidly as well. So the impact into the employment environment is like, there's opportunity to take advantage of this research, but it hasn't been around as, it hasn't been practiced very long.
No.
Yeah. Ironically, years and years ago, when I was working in the hedge fund area, we had an intentional program of trying to look for neurodiversity with our quant programmers, because we knew the way that they thought was more effective in the black box program design. And it meant that when we were hiring, we shifted some of our criteria, and we ended up with people who behaviorally behaved quite differently. Like it was kind of, like wandering around in socks all day. And, and that, like, this is quite a few years ago when that was not normal. Now it is normal. Just a bit more like, like we wanted that difference in thinking and seeing the huge advantage it brought. And so, it surprises me we haven't got more of that learning in the room yet. And it feels like a massive untapped area. And it feels like there could be some fantastic pilots that smaller businesses could run on it better than bigger businesses, because they can probably get better listening in the collective culture to like allow for something to happen, where you can potentially influence the culture more quickly in a small environment.
Wicked.
Love it.
Well, we got there, didn't we? on that, we managed to get that in there.
You managed to get that in. Jess, if people do want to connect with you and say hello, and
please, always. No, super curious to speak.
Well, not email, clearly. Please don't email Jess.
No. LinkedIn works. It's
So
LinkedIn.
Just or text message.
And personalize the invite to connect and say you heard Jess here and how fabulous she was. And obviously, we will be back on the 28th at exactly the same time. And we have Tracy Parsons finally, who hopefully won't scratch her cornea for a second time, so that she turns up. Because we're actually going to talk internal mobility and things like that. So that'll be really quite good. I think recruiters should start in before they go out. So. Yeah, 100%. And retention, so important. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you all for being so incredibly chatty in the comments as well. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Been awesome. Jess, you've been amazing.
Thank you.
Love this conversation.
Yeah, it's super fun. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
We love it.
Absolutely.
That's why we came back. We disappeared, but we're back.
We are back.
Well, we're back.
2 weeks time, right?
2 weeks time. No, I meant we're back for the show, but we'll also be back in 2 weeks time.
Oh yeah. Now I'm getting confused.
Good. On that note.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.